They didn't just silence him, they boiled him, alive. In the heart of the imperial palace, surrounded by the most powerful men in the empire, a brilliant official, once second only to the emperor, was slowly lowered into a cauldron, screaming. Why? Not for something he did, but for something he might have thought. This wasn't a punishment, it was a message. A performance of fear so calculated, so grotesque, that even centuries later, historians still whisper about it like a curse. He believed his loyalty would protect him. He was wrong. In this video, you'll uncover the twisted ritual the emperor demanded for the execution, the terrifying quote allegedly spoken before the final scream, the real reason Hui Yong was erased not just from life, but from history itself, and how this one brutal act rewired an entire empire permanently. But the most shocking part? It's not what they did to him. It's what they made everyone else do after. Stay until the end, because the final detail, hidden from official records, changes everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and fear. The first sound is not a scream, but a silence so absolute that it trembles. A court packed with officials, robes pressed, faces frozen, dares not breathe as a man is led forward, his steps unsteady but defiant. He is not shackled in the traditional sense. He is bound by something heavier, the weight of witnessing eyes, the finality of his presence here. The heat in the room is unnatural, not just because of the fire, but because of what everyone knows they're about to see. Not punishment, not justice, a lesson. There are no cries for mercy, no public proclamations of innocence. That would assume this moment had anything to do with guilt. What's about to unfold is a performance, a state-sponsored ritual, orchestrated not in secret, but under full imperial light. It is governance by spectacle, authority measured not by policy or law, but by the capacity to terrify. Few empires have understood this better than Ming China, under its founding emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang. He wasn't born into power. He carved it from famine, from war, from a world that wanted him erased. Every scar he carried, every betrayal he endured, calcified into a belief. Loyalty is not inherited, it is enforced. The man now standing before the court had once been the second most powerful individual in the empire. Hui Yong wasn't a footnote. He was the Grand Chancellor, a man whose decisions could redirect rivers of grain, raise armies, or silence dissent with a single stroke of the brush. But in this moment, none of that matters. Because this is not about him, it's about everyone watching. They say the cauldron took days to prepare, imported iron, wood selected not for burn rate but for the fragrance it released, sandalwood, pine, aromatics associated with temples and mourning, now redirected toward a more pragmatic purpose, masking the scent of cooking flesh. The liquid within, perhaps oil, perhaps brine, has been chosen not for efficiency, but for effect. Whatever its chemical makeup, the result is the same. The transformation of a man into a warning. The emperor himself will witness it. That's the point. If he did not, if he simply ordered the act and walked away, it would lack the sacred gravity required. This isn't just execution. It is exorcism, the purging of ambition, the sanctification of fear. But to understand why, one must rewind. Hui Yong's ascent was not accidental. He was born into a tradition of scholars, raised among Confucian texts and cautious hopes. He passed the imperial exams with distinction, rising through the bureaucracy like steam through cracks in stone. He was smart, yes, but more importantly, he was useful. And in the early Ming Dynasty, utility was the highest form of currency. He rebuilt systems devastated by Mongol neglect. He restructured taxation, stabilized famine zones, pacified restive provinces. He did not merely serve the emperor. He embodied the idea that governance could be orderly, precise, effective, and that was his mistake. In Zhu Yuanzhang's world, to be exceptional was to be suspect. He had clawed his way from monkhood to emperorship not by trusting, but by surviving. The idea that someone could be both capable and loyal felt contradictory to him. Trust was not a feeling, it was a risk, and risks needed to be neutralized. At first, the whispers were soft. Reports filtered through inner chambers, suggestions that Hui Yong had built a personal network, that he was consolidating too much authority, that he had begun to believe his competence made him irreplaceable. Maybe he had. Power, after all, is not a drug. It is a distortion. The more one has, the more reality bends around them. The emperor did not confront Hui. He studied. He listened. He imagined. The line between suspicion and certainty evaporated. And then came the purge. It began with a decree, but unfolded like choreography. Arrests, interrogations, scripts. Men confessed to conspiracies they'd never dreamed of, just to end the beatings. Others were tortured in front of family, their pleas weaponized as warnings. What mattered wasn't truth. What mattered was rhythm. Each confession feeding the next until a tapestry of treachery had been woven so tight, no one could pull a single thread without tearing the whole empire apart. And at its center, Hui Yong. He was accused not just of political dissent, but of occultism, of forging imperial regalia, of courting foreign alliances, of speaking treason not in public but in dreams. The accusations grew fantastical, because the more grotesque the story, the more impossible it was to defend. No one can reason against madness once madness becomes state doctrine. But even this wasn't enough. The emperor didn't want Hui Yong dead. He wanted him erased. Not just biologically removed, but spiritually, historically, politically nullified. And so the decision was made. Not for a sword, not for a hanging, but for the cauldron. The setup was meticulous. A massive iron pot, positioned not in some remote field, but within the palace complex itself. This wasn't meant to be hidden, it was meant to be witnessed. The court was summoned, not informed, but summoned. Attendance was not optional. Even those who trembled were expected to stand. And so they did. No one recorded what Hui Yong said, if he said anything. Maybe he was silent, maybe he cursed the emperor with his last breath. Or maybe he looked into the faces of those who once called him mentor, ally, brother, and saw only fear. That would have been enough. When they lowered him into the liquid, they did it slowly. That was the technique. The pain had to climb. Nerves had to fail one by one. The transformation needed to be gradual, like dawn breaking over a battlefield. He screamed. Not words, those had long since lost meaning, but something more primal. An echo pulled from the roots of humanity. Some courtiers fainted, one vomited. Another never returned to court again. But most stood. They stood because they knew that even a twitch of sympathy could be misread as allegiance. They watched because they had no choice. And when it was over, when the screaming stopped and the bubbling became background noise, the emperor finally turned away. The court was dismissed. No ashes were returned to the family. No name remained on the records. Hui Yong was not just gone. He was undone. What followed was not peace, but recalibration. The role of chancellor was abolished. No second in command would ever again stand beside the emperor. Power flowed in only one direction now, up. This wasn't an act of punishment. It was administrative restructuring masquerading as retribution, and the system remembered. For years after, ministers would glance sideways at rising colleagues, unsure whether competence was an asset or a death sentence. Bureaucrats stopped debating. Officials began to speak in riddles, or not at all. Policies passed without critique. Praise became the only acceptable form of language, and beneath it all, the steam of that day lingered, not in the air, but in memory. The execution of Hui Yong did not silence dissent. It made silence the default. The emperor didn't just kill a man, he edited the operating code of an empire. In a world where even thought could be considered betrayal, survival required invisibility. To exist was to disappear. And still, the lesson endured, not just in China. Every regime built on fear understands the utility of spectacle. Stalin had his show trials. The Romans had crucifixions. The French had the guillotine, not behind walls, but in public squares. Because repression works best when it's witnessed. But few acts in history match the brutal theatricality of boiling a man alive in the palace court. It's not efficient, it's not clean, but it is unforgettable, and that's the point. Hui Yong's story isn't one of treason, it's one of transformation, of a man turned from statesman to symbol, from a chancellor to a cautionary tale. His legacy isn't what he built, but what was built from his destruction. A government that functioned not on merit, but on fear. Not on dialogue, but on dread. There are no monuments to him, no holidays in his name. And yet, for centuries, his absence spoke louder than any statue could. In silence, in tension, in careful words chosen by officials who remembered the sound of boiling and the look in their emperor's eyes. Power, when built on fear, does not need to kill often. It needs only to kill once, perfectly. That single moment, flames beneath the cauldron, robes damp with steam, eyes forced open, became the fulcrum of an entire era. Officials restructured their thoughts before they could become words. Trust collapsed into performance. Praise was delivered with trembling precision. What had once been an administrative hierarchy turned into a whispering pyramid of survival. And yet, Zhu Yuanzhang remained unsatisfied. Because paranoia, once it lodges in the mind, becomes a kind of hunger, bottomless, irrational, insatiable. He tightened surveillance, introduced new laws that criminalized implication. One could be punished not only for speaking against the emperor. In this new paradigm, Hui Yong's execution was not a conclusion. It was a template. The emperor didn't just remove a rival. He demonstrated a mechanism, a political machine lubricated by fear, calibrated by pain, and fueled by the silence of witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives wondering whether today's obedience would still be enough tomorrow. The cauldron may have cooled, but the empire had been branded. The cauldron may have cooled, but the empire had been branded. In the shadows cast by this act, the machinery of governance transformed. Surveillance no longer required walls or wires. It lived in the eyes of colleagues, in the pause before a sentence, in the trembling hand that signed decrees. There was no need for constant purges, just the memory of one done perfectly. Children of officials grew up learning that to speak too clearly was dangerous, that ambition had an expiration date, and that loyalty was not a virtue, but a mask worn so tightly it left bruises. Poetry vanished from court, art grew ornamental, language itself retreated into formula, rigid and cold. It was safer to echo than to think. Yet the emperor's fear only deepened. He had built an empire in his own image, hungry, hardened, suspicious, but even total control left him restless. He began drafting new codes of conduct, reissuing laws that punished not only action, but sentiment. Disloyalty became a matter of interpretation. Indifference could be fatal. A single misplaced compliment, a misread glance, a delay in applause, each became potential treason. And still, Zhu Yuanzhang ruled. For over 30 years he maintained his grip, not through affection or vision, but through the constant reminder that resistance, or even misinterpretation, could end not just in removal, but in obliteration. The people didn't revere the emperor, they internalized him. He became a presence that haunted even private thoughts. Historians today struggle with the paradox. A man who unified a fractured land, restored order, expanded infrastructure, and yet ruled through fear, so thick it infected the very idea of memory. Because that's the true weight of Hui Yong's story, not just in his vanishing, but in what was taught through that vanishing. It wasn't just a warning to officials, it was a new law of nature. In Zhu's court, excellence became a threat. Diligence was a liability. Merit, once a path to power, became a dangerous spotlight. What mattered most was invisibility, the ability to serve without being seen, to succeed without standing out. And so, an entire class of talent buried itself beneath robes of neutrality. But fear is expensive. Maintaining a regime where thought itself is suspect requires constant effort. New whispers began to emerge, this time about military officers, poets, even family members. The emperor aged, but his paranoia ripened. He no longer waited for disloyalty. He anticipated it, conjured it, punished it before it could be born. Preemptive loyalty tests became common. Executions continued. Entire lineages were erased for imagined slights. And Hui Yong, though long gone, remained a ghost in every chamber. He was never mentioned by name, his portrait destroyed, his records redacted. But in every cautious decision, every trembling official signature, he lived. In every moment of silence where there might have once been speech, he whispered. In this way, he achieved something no living official ever could: eternal influence through absence. It's said that terror is loud when it arrives, but quiet when it settles. That's what Zhu achieved. Not an empire perpetually screaming, but one holding its breath indefinitely. In the decades after his reign, future emperors inherited this structure of power. Absolute at the top, disposable below. They used less fire, perhaps, but the lesson remained. One perfect spectacle of fear could do more than 100 new laws. And all it took was one man, boiled not for what he did, but for what he represented. A reminder, in some systems the danger is not in failure, it's in being noticed. And so, the cauldron remains, not in iron, not in oil, but in every regime that finds utility in public obedience and private silence. Not every emperor needs to use it. They just need to ensure everyone remembers it once existed. That is the legacy of Hui Yong, not as a traitor, not as a martyr, but as the most powerful kind of symbol, one no one dares to name, but everyone remembers. That is the legacy of Hui Yong, not as a traitor, not as a martyr, but as the most powerful kind of symbol, one no one dares to name, but everyone remembers. And yet, symbols never rest. They shift, evolve, bleed into new shapes with each generation that inherits their shadow. Hui Yong's name may have vanished from scrolls, but his imprint lingered in the decisions made by every official who followed, in the architecture of palaces designed with sightlines to observe, in the etiquette manuals that taught how to bow without ambition. In the centuries that followed, rulers across dynasties refined the mechanics of fear. Some used spectacle, others preferred subtlety, but all drew from the blueprint laid that day at court, not the boiling itself, but what it represented, the removal of uncertainty by eliminating possibility. In such systems, the greatest threat is not rebellion, it's imagination. But even silence is never final. History has a way of circling back, not to repeat itself exactly, but to echo, distorted, repurposed, alive again in new forms. The architecture of fear does not always vanish with the fall of its builders. It survives in cultural reflexes, in institutional habits, in the very language of leadership. Generations later, long after Zhu Yuanzhang's dynasty turned to dust, the mechanisms he perfected remained dormant beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to awaken. When the Qing dynasty replaced the Ming, they inherited not just a throne, but the scars etched into the bureaucracy itself. Their emperors, too, understood the value of being feared. The idea that a leader must be both distant and divine, unchallengeable and unquestionable, did not fade. It calcified. And across oceans and centuries, the same strategy would appear elsewhere. Not always with boiling cauldrons, sometimes with blacklists, sometimes with walls, sometimes with algorithms. Because the nature of fear is that it adapts. Modern authoritarian regimes have learned from the ancients, even if unknowingly. The spectacle remains. It's simply updated. Trials are broadcast. Dissenters vanish not in fire, but in legal labyrinths. State propaganda doesn't need to erase facts. It only needs to flood the field with so many conflicting truths that belief itself collapses. The lesson of Hui Yong becomes not just a cautionary tale, but a playbook. Silence is still cultivated, not by force alone, but through fatigue, through the normalization of absurdity, through the slow erosion of the space between public compliance and private conscience. And still, the logic remains the same: obedience over clarity, survival over expression. But there is another legacy, quieter still. In hidden diaries, in footnotes buried beneath state-approved textbooks, in the whispered stories passed down by families who remembered someone who once disappeared. Resistance, too, can take on spectral form, not in open revolt, but in the act of remembering, in the refusal to forget the cost of silence. And so the ghost of Hui Yong lives not only in the fearful pause of a bureaucrat or the calculated ambiguity of a politician. He lives in the historian who digs too deeply, in the writer who alludes without naming, in the citizen who dares to ask, what happened before this silence? Because all regimes eventually end, but the questions they suppress often remain. What is the cost of absolute control? What is the weight of a government built on erasure? What kind of legacy is forged in the space where a man once stood, and where now only the memory of steam lingers? If we listen carefully to the silences in history, we may hear them whisper back, not with answers, but with the one thing that tyrants fear most: another question. If we listen carefully to the silences in history, we may hear them whisper back, not with answers, but with the one thing that tyrants fear most: another question. And it begins here. What makes fear so effective that it outlives the men who first wield it? In the halls of power, fear is not always shouted. It wears fine silk and speaks in passive voice. It shows up not in prisons, but in promotions denied, in pauses that linger too long after a risky idea is spoken. Fear doesn't need to punish every offense. It only needs to punish one, so thoroughly, so publicly, that everyone else learns the rules by watching. We live in a world where ancient rituals of control have found new disguises, where data replaces informants, where digital silence, no likes, no shares, no posts, can feel as loud as a scream once did. And yet, beneath the code, beneath the performance, the principle remains the same. To be seen is to be vulnerable. But something else has shifted. The tools of fear are not exclusive anymore. Just as rulers once built systems to suppress, people now build systems to remember. The internet, for all its flaws, resists erasure. Whispers become archives, secrets surface. The old mechanisms begin to crack under the weight of collective memory. Hui Yong's name, once scrubbed from the scrolls, now circulates again. Not in official chronicles, but in essays, in podcasts, in dramatizations, and digital footnotes. His absence is no longer guaranteed, and in that return there is a quiet revolt, a reclamation of what history tried to bury. That is why this story matters now, not because it is distant, but because it is familiar. Because the tactics may change, but the intention rarely does, and because in every generation someone like Hui Yong will rise. Brilliant, efficient, loyal until loyalty is redefined by the anxieties of those above. So we remember not just his fall, but the fire built around him. We study not just his silence, but the system that engineered it. And we speak, not to summon the past, but to ensure the future is not shaped by the same machinery. Fear may endure, but so does memory. And as long as memory resists, silence will never truly win.